A woman sat alone on the charred roof of a burning homestead, her infant son wrapped tight against her chest, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. When Ethan Ryder rode into that ruined clearing expecting silence, he found something far more unsettling, someone who'd already given up on being saved. What he did next would cost him the life he'd built in solitude and force him to face a question he'd spent years avoiding: whether a man could choose to stay when everything in him had learned to run. If you want to see how two broken people forge something unbreakable from the ashes of betrayal and abandonment, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The gelding's hooves crunched over blackened timber and ash as Ethan Ryder pulled the reins, his jaw tightening against the acrid smell of burnt wood. He'd been riding 3 days straight from the rail station in Coulter's Bend, taking a shortcut through land he knew had been settled 2 summers back. The homestead shouldn't have looked like this. A skeleton of charred beams and collapsed walls, smoke still threading thin and gray into the cloudless sky. He dismounted slowly, scanning the wreckage with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many disasters and learned not to expect survivors. The barn was gone. The chicken coop was a black smear. The well stood intact, its bucket hanging crooked on the rope, but everything else had been claimed by fire. That's when he saw her. She sat on what remained of the roof, a section of planks that had somehow survived the blaze, angled precariously over the collapsed interior. Her dress was soot-stained and torn at the hem. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, dark and tangled, and in her arms, wrapped in a faded quilt, was an infant. Ethan froze. She wasn't crying, wasn't calling for help, just sitting there staring out toward the eastern hills like she was waiting for a stage that had already left. "Ma'am!" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't turn. He moved closer, boots crunching over debris. "Ma'am, you need to get down from there. That roof's going to give." Still nothing. Her gaze stayed locked on the distance, her arms cradling the child with a stillness that felt wrong. Ethan had seen grief before, had carried enough of it himself, but this was something else. This was someone who'd stopped expecting anything to change. He approached the collapsed wall, testing his footing on a half-burned beam. "I'm coming up." "Don't." The word came out flat without inflection. Not a plea, not a warning, just a statement of fact. Ethan paused. "You can't stay up there." "Why not?" The question caught him off guard. He looked up at her, trying to make sense of the woman perched above the ruin of her life. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes dry and distant. The baby stirred against her chest, a small sound escaping its bundled form, but she didn't look down. "Because it's not safe," he said, choosing the simplest truth. "Safe," she repeated, almost like she was tasting the word. "Nothing's safe." Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing around the wreckage. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just fire and absence. What happened here? She finally looked at him then, and the emptiness in her gaze made something tighten in his chest. "He left." "Who left?" "James." Her voice didn't waver. "Said he'd be back in 2 weeks. Told me to keep the home fires burning." A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. "I did." Ethan stared at her, realization settling cold in his gut. "You burned it yourself." "No?" She shook her head once. "Lightning took the barn. Wind carried it to the house. I just didn't put it out." The baby made another sound, and this time she shifted her hold, adjusting the quilt with mechanical precision. Ethan could see the child's face now, small, maybe 3 or 4 months old, with a thatch of dark hair and eyes that hadn't yet learned to focus. "How long's he been gone?" Ethan asked. 6 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. The specificity of it hit harder than tears would have. This wasn't a woman lost in grief. This was someone who'd been counting, holding on to the only numbers that still meant anything. "He's not coming back," Ethan said, gentler than he'd intended. "I know." She looked away again, back toward those distant hills. "But I said I'd wait." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration and something uncomfortably close to pity warring in his chest. He didn't do this, didn't get involved, didn't take on other people's burdens. He'd left that version of himself behind years ago, along with everything else that had once mattered. But standing there in the ash and ruin, Looking up at a woman who'd chosen to sit in the wreckage of her promises, he couldn't just ride away. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated like she'd almost forgotten. "Clara. Clara Vance. Clara." He tested it, then gestured to the broken homestead around them. "You got any family? Anyone who could take you in?" "No." "Friends? Neighbors?" "Nearest neighbor's 20 miles south. Never met them." Ethan swore under his breath. "You been up there since the fire?" "Since yesterday morning. A day and a half. With an infant. In the cold." He looked at her again, really looked, and saw the tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide, the way her lips were chapped and bloodless. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was just too exhausted to do anything else. "All right," he said, making a decision he knew he'd regret. "I'm going to climb up there. You're going to hand me the baby, then you're coming down." "I told you." "I don't care what you told me." His voice came out harder than he meant it to. "You can sit up there and wait for a ghost if that's what you want, but you're not doing it with a child in your arms. You want to give up, fine, but you don't get to make that choice for him." Clara's expression flickered, the first real emotion he'd seen. Her arms tightened around the bundle, protective and fierce, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then slowly, she looked down at the infant's face. "His name is Thomas," she said quietly. "Thomas," Ethan repeated. "That's good. Strong name." He climbed carefully, testing each beam before putting his weight on it. The roof groaned but held. When he reached her, he held out his arms. "I'll take him. Then I'll help you down." Clara didn't move for a long moment, her gaze searching his face like she was trying to decide if he was real or just another thing the frontier had conjured to break her. Finally, with a care that spoke of deep, bone-weary resignation, she passed Thomas into his arms. The baby was warm and solid, heavier than Ethan expected. He cradled the child against his chest, one hand supporting the small head, and felt an unfamiliar pressure behind his ribs. It had been a long time since he'd held something this fragile. "Now you," he said. Clara rose unsteadily, her legs shaking after hours of stillness. Ethan guided her with his free hand, leading her across the precarious planks to the edge where the descent was manageable. She climbed down with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring whether she fell, and when her feet hit solid ground, she swayed. Ethan was beside her in an instant, still holding Thomas. "When's the last time you ate?" She didn't answer, just reached for her son with hands that trembled. He stepped back. "Answer the question first." "2 days?" Her voice was faint. "Maybe 3. "Christ!" Ethan looked around the ruins, then at his horse standing patient near the well. He'd planned to make camp another 10 miles west, in the shelter of the pine brake he'd used on the way out, but that was before he'd found a starving woman and an infant in the middle of nowhere. "I've got supplies," he said. "Not much, but enough. You're going to eat, then we'll figure out what comes next." "I'm not leaving." Clara's chin lifted, a flash of the stubbornness that had kept her alive showing through the exhaustion. "This is my home." "Your home's Ash, ma'am. There's nothing here but—" "He'll come back," she interrupted, though her voice cracked on the words. "He said he would. He promised." Ethan studied her face, the determination fighting against the despair, the way her whole body seemed to be held together by nothing but the force of her refusal to accept what was already true. He'd seen men like this before, soldiers who kept marching long after the war was over because they couldn't face what waited in the silence. "Tell you what," he said, shifting Thomas in his arms. "You come with me for 1 night. Get some food, some rest. In the morning, if you still want to stay here, I'll bring you back." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm not in the habit of leaving women and babies to die of exposure." He said it bluntly, without kindness, and watched her flinch. "Good. Maybe bluntness would get through where sympathy wouldn't." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting from Thomas to the wreckage of her home, then back to Ethan's face. "1 night," she said finally. "1 night," he agreed. He handed Thomas back to her, then went to his horse, digging through his saddlebag for the jerky and hardtack he'd been rationing. When he returned, Clara was sitting on the ground near the well, her back against the stone, the baby nursing beneath the quilt. She took the food he offered without looking at him, eating slowly, mechanically, like her body had forgotten how. Ethan built a small fire from the scraps of unburned wood, keeping it low and contained. The sun was dropping fast, painting the wreckage in shades of orange and gold that made it look almost beautiful. Clara finished eating and leaned her head back against the well, eyes closing. "You got anything you want to take?" he asked. "Clothes, tools, anything that survived?" "No." She didn't open her eyes. "It all burned." He didn't push. Instead, he settled across from her, watching the shadows lengthen across the broken land. This wasn't his problem. He'd done his good deed. He'd gotten her down, fed her, made sure she wasn't going to freeze overnight. Come morning, he'd bring her back like he'd promised, and then he'd ride on to the claim he'd been heading toward for the past month. Someone else could figure out what to do with Clara Vance and her absent husband. But as the night deepened and Clara's breathing evened out into sleep, Thomas quiet against her chest, Ethan found himself staring at the ruins and thinking about all the things people promised, and all the ways those promises turned to ash. They rode out at first light. Clara sat behind him on the gelding, Thomas strapped to her chest with a makeshift sling Ethan had fashioned from his spare shirt. She didn't speak, didn't look back at the homestead as they left it behind, just held her son and stared at the horizon with the same empty focus she'd had on the roof. Ethan's camp was a day's ride northwest, tucked in a valley where a creek ran year-round and the land rolled gentle enough for grazing. He'd spent the better part of a year building a cabin there. Rough work, but solid. One room, a stone fireplace, a loft for storage. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd built it specifically to be far enough from everything that nobody would bother him. That plan was working out real well. When they arrived, Clara slid down from the horse without waiting for his help, landing hard and stumbling before catching herself. She looked at the cabin, the small corral, the garden plot he'd started last spring, and something in her expression shifted. Not hope, exactly. More like recognition. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yeah." "Why?" The question was too direct, too raw. Ethan busied himself unsaddling the gelding. "Same reason anybody lives alone, prefer it that way." Clara didn't respond, just stood there holding Thomas, looking lost in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten with irritation. He gestured toward the cabin. "You can sleep in the loft, there's blankets up there. Water's in the bucket by the door. Privy's around back." She nodded once and went inside. Ethan took his time with the horse, brushing him down, checking his hooves, doing all the small tasks that let him avoid going back into the cabin and facing whatever awkward silence waited there. But eventually, there was nothing left to do, and he had to go in. Clara was sitting on the floor near the fireplace, Thomas asleep in her lap, staring at the cold hearth, like she'd forgotten how fire worked. Ethan crouched beside her and started building a fire, the familiar motions giving him something to focus on besides the woman who'd invaded his solitude. "You said one night," Clara said quietly. "That's what I said." "And then you'll take me back, if that's what you want." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing absent patterns on Thomas's back. "What do you think I should do?" Ethan paused, a piece of kindling in his hand. "Don't matter what I think. I'm asking anyway." He looked at her then, at the exhaustion etched into her face, the way she held her son like he was the only solid thing left in her world. "I think you should stop waiting for a man who left you with nothing. I think you should figure out what you want that doesn't depend on someone else showing up." Clara's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about him. About us." "You're right, I don't." Ethan struck the flint, sparks catching in the tinder. "But I know what a burned homestead looks like, and I know what it means when a man's been gone 6 months and counting." He had reasons. I'm sure he did. The fire caught, flames licking up through the kindling. Ethan sat back on his heels. Every man who walks away has reasons. Question is whether those reasons matter more than the people he left behind. Clara's hand stilled on Thomas's back. "You left someone." It wasn't a question. Ethan felt the words land like a punch, precise and unavoidable. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I did." "Why?" "Because I was good at it." He stood, brushing ash from his hands. "At leaving. Got real good at it after the war. Kept doing it until there was nobody left to leave." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, there was something other than emptiness in her eyes. Something sharp and searching. "Do you regret it?" The question hung in the space between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan thought about his brother's farm, sold off to pay debts. The woman he'd been engaged to, married to someone else now with 3 kids and a life he'd never been part of. The friends who'd stopped writing after the 5th unanswered letter. "Every damn day," he said. He left her by the fire and went outside, needing the cold air and the silence of the valley to steady himself. This was exactly why he didn't do this. Didn't let people in. Didn't get tangled up in their stories. Because once you started caring, once you let yourself see the wreckage up close, it became impossible to walk away clean. Behind him, through the cabin's single window, he could see Clara settling Thomas into a nest of blankets on the floor. Her movements were slow, careful, like she was conserving energy she didn't have. When she was done, she curled up beside the baby, one hand resting on his small chest, and closed her eyes. Ethan watched until he was sure she was asleep. Then he went to the woodpile and started splitting logs, working until his shoulders burned and the confusion in his head settled into something manageable. One night, he reminded himself, that's all he'd promised. But even then, staring at the axe buried in the stump, he knew it was already more complicated than that. Out. Clara didn't ask to go back in the morning. She woke before dawn, fed Thomas, and started cleaning the cabin without a word, sweeping the floor, organizing the supplies on the shelf, scrubbing the pot he'd left crusted with yesterday's beans. Ethan watched her from the doorway, coffee in hand, trying to figure out if he should stop her or just let it happen. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. "I know." She didn't look up from the pot. "But I'm here. Might as well make myself useful." "Thought you wanted to go back." Clara's hand stilled. She set the pot down carefully, staring at it like it held answers. "I did. Last night I was sure." She turned to face him, and there was something different in her expression. Not hope, but a kind of grim clarity. "But I woke up this morning and realized I don't actually want to sit in the ash waiting for him. I just don't know what else to do." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, buying himself time. "So stay." "Here?" "Here. Couple more days, week maybe. Give yourself time to figure it out." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Why would you let me do that?" "Because I've got the space. And because—" He hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than dancing around it. "Because I've spent the last 3 years trying to convince myself that not caring is the same as being free. Might do me good to remember what it's like to actually help somebody." She studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if he was lying. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. I can work. I'm not useless." "Didn't say you were." Clara turned back to the pot, her shoulders tight. "1 week," she said. "Then I'll go." "All right." But they both knew it was a lie. The days folded into each other with a strange, careful rhythm. Clara took over the cooking, stretching Ethan's meager supplies into meals that actually tasted like something. She mended his shirts, patched the holes in the cabin's roof where the rain had started to seep through, kept Thomas quiet and content in the corner while Ethan worked the land. In return, Ethan hunted, kept the firewood stocked, fixed the broken leg on the table Clara had been using as a makeshift cradle. They moved around each other like dancers learning a new pattern, not quite synchronized, but not stepping on each other's toes either. They didn't talk much. Clara seemed to exist in a space between exhaustion and determination, going through the motions of living without fully inhabiting any of it. And Ethan didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that some silences were better left alone. But on the 5th night, as they sat by the fire after Thomas had been put down, Clara broke it. "What was her name?" Ethan looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Who?" "The woman you left." He should have deflected, should have told her it was none of her business. But there was something in Clara's voice, not curiosity, but a kind of weary solidarity that made him answer. "Margaret." Clara nodded slowly. "Did you love her?" "Thought I did." He set the harness aside. "Looking back, I think I loved the idea of her more than the actual person. She was everything I was supposed to want. Pretty, came from a good family, knew how to run a household, but I didn't know her. Not really." "What happened?" "War happened." Ethan stared into the fire. "I went off thinking I'd come back a hero. We'd get married, have the life we'd planned. Instead, I came back angry and broken, and every time she looked at me, I could see her trying to find the man she'd agreed to marry. He wasn't there anymore. Clara was quiet for a moment. So you left. So I left. He met her gaze. Told myself it was the kind thing to do. Let her find someone who could be what she needed. Truth is, I was just too much of a coward to stay and watch myself fail. That's not cowardice, Clara said. That's self-preservation. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a prettier name for the same thing. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. James wasn't like that. He was loud, confident, promised me the world. Said we'd build a life out here. That it would be hard, but we'd do it together. Her voice went flat. Turns out together only counted when things were going well. How'd you meet him? My father's store. I was working the counter when he came in, all charm and big plans. I'd never left Virginia, never seen anything outside of the same 4 streets I'd grown up on. He made the frontier sound like freedom. Ethan heard the bitterness threading through her words. Your family approve? No. Clara's laugh was sharp. My father forbade it, said James was a con man, that I'd regret it. We fought. I told him he was just scared I'd have a better life than he'd given me. Then I married James anyway and left without saying goodbye. She pressed her forehead to her knees. Turns out my father was right. You write to them? Let them know what happened? Can't. Claire's voice went very small. My father died 6 months after I left. Heart gave out. My mother wrote to tell me. I never wrote back. Didn't know what to say. Ethan felt the weight of it settle between them. All the things they'd both run from, all the bridges they'd burned thinking they were choosing freedom. That why you stayed at the homestead, even after the fire? Partly. Clara lifted her head. Mostly I needed to believe he was coming back, because if he wasn't, then I'd left everything for nothing. I destroyed my family for a man who didn't even care enough to stay. That's not on you, Ethan said. Man makes a promise. It's on him to keep it. Maybe. But I'm the one who believed him. I'm the one who chose this. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You know what I learned after the war? People don't choose the things that break them. They just choose what they do after. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since he'd found her on that roof, something in her expression cracked. Not tears, she was too worn out for tears, but a kind of raw acknowledgement that she wasn't alone in this particular kind of ruin. What do you do after? She asked. Hell if I know, Ethan said. I'm still figuring it out. They sat in silence after that, the fire burning low, the night pressing close around the cabin. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, the kind of silence that felt like it had weight. Inside, something had shifted between them. Not comfort exactly, but understanding. The recognition that they were both people who'd lost things they couldn't get back and were trying to figure out how to live with the empty spaces. Eventually, Clara rose, checked on Thomas, and climbed up to the loft. Ethan stayed by the fire until it died to embers, then stretched out on the floor with a blanket and tried to sleep. But he lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways a person could choose to stay and all the reasons they didn't. 1 week became 2, then 3, and neither of them mentioned it. Clara settled into the rhythm of the cabin like she'd always been there. She woke before Ethan most mornings, had coffee brewing by the time he came in from checking the horses. Thomas grew bigger, more alert, started making sounds that weren't quite words but weren't just noise either. The cabin that had been Ethan's refuge from the world became something else. Not crowded exactly, but occupied in a way that made him notice the silence when Clara took the baby outside. It was strange having another person move through his space. Strange in ways both irritating and oddly comforting. Clara had a habit of reorganizing things. His tools, his supplies, the firewood stack, always putting them back in places that made more sense than where he'd had them. It drove him crazy at first, until he realized he could actually find things now. She didn't talk much during the day. Most of their conversations happened at night, after Thomas was asleep and the work was done. They'd sit by the fire and Clara would ask him questions about the land, about how he'd ended up here, about the war he'd mentioned in passing. Ethan found himself answering more than he intended, telling her things he hadn't said out loud in years. In return, Clara started offering pieces of her own story. Not all at once, she wasn't built that way, but bit by bit, like someone carefully laying out fragments of broken glass to see if they still made a picture. It was during one of those nights, about a month after she'd arrived, that she told him about the baby. "Thomas isn't James's son," she said abruptly, staring into her coffee cup. Ethan looked up from the saddle strap he was oiling. "What? I mean, James thinks he is. Thought he was. But he's not." Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. "There was a man in Coulter's Bend, a clerk at the land office. James used to leave me there when he went to file claims, sometimes for hours. This man, Samuel, he was kind, asked how I was doing, brought me tea, actually listened when I talked." She paused. "It only happened once. I was lonely and stupid, and I convinced myself it didn't mean anything." Ethan set down the strap, his full attention on her now. "James know?" "No, I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after. The timing was close enough that I could—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "I told myself it didn't matter who the father was, that James would be a good husband, a good father, that we'd make it work. And then he left. And then he left." Clara finally looked up, and her eyes were dry but hard. "You want to know the worst part? When I realized I was pregnant, I was happy. I thought maybe a baby would make him stay in one place, stop chasing every rumor of gold or easy money. I thought it would fix us." She laughed, bitter. "Instead, it just gave him one more thing to run from." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing. "The clerk, Samuel, he know about Thomas?" "No, I never told him. Don't even know if he's still in Coulter's Bend." Clara set her cup down with deliberate care. "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm not ashamed of Thomas. He's mine. That's all that matters. You tell me this because you think I'll judge you?" "No." She met his gaze straight on. "I told you because you deserve to know who you're letting stay under your roof. And because I'm tired of carrying secrets." Ethan picked up the strap again, more to give his hand something to do than because it needed more work. "We've all got things we're not proud of. Doesn't change the fact that you're a good mother. Doesn't change the fact that James was a fool for leaving." Claire's expression softened slightly. "You're not going to ask me to go?" "Why would I?" "Because I lied. To James, to myself. Because Thomas isn't who everyone thinks he is." "Thomas is a baby," Ethan said. "He didn't ask to be born into this mess, and he doesn't deserve to suffer for it. Far as I'm concerned, what happened before doesn't matter. What matters is what happens now." Clara looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her face. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. We haven't gotten to the hard part." "What's the hard part?" Ethan gestured around the cabin. "Figuring out what comes next. You can't stay here forever living on my charity, and I can't keep pretending this arrangement doesn't complicate things." "What kind of complications?" He chose his words carefully. "People talk. Lone man, woman, and baby living under one roof. Doesn't matter that nothing's happening. They'll assume it is." Claire's jaw tightened. "Let them assume." "Easy to say when you're not the one who has to face it. I go into town for supplies. People start asking questions, looking at me different. You want to stay here? We need to figure out how to make it legitimate." "Legitimate how?" Ethan hadn't meant to say it, hadn't even fully formed the thought until the words were out. "We could get married." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Clara stared at him like he'd suggested they burn down the cabin and dance in the ashes. "That's insane," she said finally. "Is it?" Ethan kept his voice level. "Think about it. You need a home, security, someone to help raise Thomas. Hell, I don't know what I need. But having you here works. We get along. We help each other. Why not make it official?" "Because marriage isn't a business arrangement." "Sometimes it is. My parents' marriage was a business arrangement. They made it work for 40 years. Clara stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Your parents didn't have my history. They weren't built on lies." "What lies?" Ethan stood too, frustration creeping into his voice. "I know about James. I know about Samuel. I know Thomas isn't who people think he is. There's no deception here. There's the lie that we love each other." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Ethan felt them land but didn't flinch. "Never said anything about love. I'm talking about partnership. Two people trying to survive helping each other do it." Clara turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "And what happens when you decide you're done? When you get tired of playing house and remember you're better off alone?" What happens when James comes back? It was a low blow, and Ethan knew it. Clara's face went white, then red. He's not coming back. You sure about that? Because a month ago you were sitting on a roof waiting for him. That was different. I was different. Were you? Ethan pressed. Or are you just swapping one man for another, hoping this time it works out? Clara's hand came up fast, the slap cracking across his cheek before either of them fully registered she'd moved. Ethan's head snapped to the side, more from surprise than force. When he looked back at her, Clara's eyes were blazing with an anger that was somehow cleaner than anything he'd seen in her before. "Don't you dare," she said, voice shaking. "Don't you dare compare yourself to him. You think I'm here because I'm weak? Because I need a man to take care of me? I'm here because I made a choice to survive. Every morning I wake up and choose to keep going, for Thomas, for myself. Not for James. Not for you. For me." Ethan touched his cheek, feeling the sting. "Then what do you want?" "I want to stop being afraid," Clara said. And suddenly the anger was gone, replaced by something rawer. "I want to look at the future and not see nothing but ash and waiting. I want Thomas to grow up somewhere stable, somewhere he doesn't have to carry his mother's mistakes." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But I don't want to trap you into something you don't want. And I don't want to be someone's obligation." "You're not an obligation." Ethan took a step closer, keeping his movement slow. "You work harder than anyone I've ever met. You're smart. Capable. You don't complain. Having you here doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like—" He struggled for the word. "It feels like I'm not just existing anymore, like there's a point to the work beyond just surviving another day." Clara's arms tightened around herself. "That's not love." "No," Ethan agreed, "but maybe it's enough." She studied his face, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give. "What if it's not? What if we do this and end up hating each other? Then at least we tried. At least we didn't spend the rest of our lives wondering what if." Clara was quiet for so long Ethan thought she might walk away. Then, slowly, she nodded. "If we do this, there are rules." "All right. No pretending. We don't lie to each other about what this is." "Agreed. And if either of us wants out, we say so. No staying out of guilt or obligation." Ethan hesitated on that one, knowing how easily those promises could crumble, but he nodded. "Agreed." Clara took a shaky breath. "Okay. Okay? Okay." She looked up at him, and there was fear in her eyes, but also something like determination. "Let's get married." They didn't shake hands, didn't embrace, just stood there in the firelight, two broken people agreeing to try building something from the wreckage, and hoped it would be enough to hold. The next morning, Ethan rode into Bridger's Point, the nearest town with a courthouse. It was a 2-day trip there and back, which meant leaving Clara alone with Thomas at the cabin. He didn't like it, but there wasn't another option. "You know how to use a rifle?" he asked before leaving. Clara gave him a look. "James might have been useless, but he taught me to shoot." "Good." Ethan pulled his spare Winchester from the rack. "Keep this loaded. Anyone comes around you don't know, you don't open the door." "I'm not helpless, Ethan." "Never said you were, but I'd feel better knowing you can defend yourself." Clara took the rifle, checking the action with practiced ease. 2 days? 2 days. 3 if the weather turns. She nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "Be careful." It was such a simple thing, that small expression of concern, but it lodged somewhere in Ethan's chest and stayed there the whole ride to town. Nobody had told him to be careful in years. Nobody had cared enough to bother. Bridger's Point was a rough place, the kind of town that existed purely for supply and vice. Ethan kept his head down, made his business quick. He found the clerk at the courthouse, paid the fee, got the license. The clerk barely looked at him, just filled in the blanks and shoved the paper across the desk. "Need a witness when you do the ceremony," the man said around a wad of tobacco. "And someone to officiate. Judge Miller does it for $5. Ethan paid, took the license, and left. On his way out of town, he stopped at the general store, spending more than he should have on fabric, thread, and a few yards of lace. He didn't know anything about women's clothes, but the shopkeeper's wife took pity on him and helped him pick out something that would work for a dress. "Getting married?" the woman asked, wrapping the fabric in paper. "Yeah." "Lucky girl." She smiled, but there was something knowing in her expression. "Though I suspect you're the lucky one." Ethan didn't argue. He took the package, loaded it onto his horse, and headed back, pushing harder than he should have, wanting to be home before dark. When he crested the last hill and saw the cabin below, smoke rising from the chimney, something in him settled. Clara was outside, hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between two trees. Thomas was in a basket at her feet, waving his arms at nothing in particular. The whole scene was so ordinary, so domestic, that for a moment Ethan couldn't breathe around the strangeness of wanting it. Clara looked up as he rode in, shading her eyes against the sun. That was fast. Didn't see the point in dragging it out. He dismounted, pulling the package from his saddlebag. "Got you something." She took the parcel, frowning. "What is it?" "Fabric for a dress. Figured you'd want something. I don't know, nicer than what you've got." Clara unwrapped the paper slowly, revealing the soft blue cotton and the white lace. Her fingers traced the pattern, and when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Clara, no one's ever—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "James never bought me anything. Said we couldn't afford it, that practical was more important than pretty." Ethan felt an irrational surge of anger at a man he'd never met. "Well, you're going to be my wife. Figured you should have something that makes you feel like it." Clara clutched the fabric to her chest, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled, really smiled. Not the bitter twist of lips he'd seen before, but something genuine. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I don't know if I got enough. The shopkeeper's wife said it should be plenty, but it's perfect." Clara looked down at the fabric, then back at him. "When?" "Got the license. Need to find a witness and someone to officiate. Figured we'd ride back to town in a few days, get it done." "Do we have to go to town?" Ethan frowned. "Where else would we do it?" "Here." Clara gestured to the valley around them. "This is our home. Shouldn't we start our marriage here?" "We need an officiant, someone with authority. There's a circuit preacher who comes through the northern settlements. I saw a notice in Coulter's Bend once. If we can find him, maybe he'd come here." Ethan considered it. The idea appealed to him more than he wanted to admit, keeping this thing between them private, away from the knowing looks and gossip of town. "All right, I'll ask around, see if I can track him down." It took another week to find the preacher. Turned out he was staying at a homestead 15 miles north, tending to a family whose patriarch had died. Ethan rode out, explained the situation, and the preacher, a tired-looking man named Reverend Collins, agreed to come. "Don't get many marriage requests out here," Collins said. "Mostly funerals and baptisms. It'll be nice to do something hopeful for a change." They set the date for the following Sunday. Ethan rode back and told Clara, who nodded and disappeared into the cabin with her fabric and thread. For the next 3 days, she sewed in every spare moment, her fingers flying over the material with a skill he hadn't known she possessed. On Saturday night, she showed him the finished dress. It was simple. No elaborate trim or fancy details, but it fit her perfectly, the blue bringing out the color in her eyes, the lace at the collar and cuffs giving it a touch of elegance. "It's good," Ethan said, inadequate words for something that made his chest tight. Clara smoothed the fabric self-consciously. "I'm out of practice. Had to take apart one of my old skirts to get the pattern right." "It's perfect." She looked at him, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but acknowledgement. They were doing this. Actually doing this. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Reverend Collins arrived at noon, riding a sway-backed mare and carrying a worn Bible. He greeted them warmly, blessed Thomas, and then got down to business. "You got a witness?" he asked. Ethan hadn't thought of that. "No." "Need someone. Can't marry you without it." They stood there awkwardly, looking at each other. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and Ethan barely knew them. Clara bit her lip, thinking. "What about Mrs. Keller?" she said suddenly. "From the way station on the East Road. I met her once when James and I first came through. She seemed kind." It was a long shot, but they didn't have other options. Ethan rode out, found Mrs. Keller at the station, and explained the situation. The older woman's eyes lit up with interest. "A wedding, out here. I wouldn't miss it for the world." She came back with him, bringing a basket of food and a bottle of wine she'd been saving. By the time they returned, Clara had changed into her new dress and pinned her hair up with a few wildflowers she'd found growing near the creek. Ethan stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, Her face was too thin, her hands too rough from work. But standing there in the blue dress with the afternoon light streaming through the window, she looked like someone worth staying for. "Ready?" Reverend Collins asked. They gathered in front of the fireplace. Mrs. Keller stood to the side, beaming like this was the most exciting thing to happen to her in years. Thomas slept in his basket, oblivious to the fact that his life was about to change. Reverend Collins opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved—" "Can we skip that part?" Clara interrupted. Collins blinked. "Skip it?" "The traditional vows, the parts about love and cherishing." She glanced at Ethan. "We'd rather just say what we mean." The Reverend looked uncertain, but he closed the Bible. "All right. Unorthodox, but all right. Mr. Ryder, do you take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" Ethan looked at Clara, at the determination in her eyes and the fear she was trying to hide. "I do." "And do you promise to honor her, provide for her, and stand by her in sickness and health?" "I do." Collins turned to Clara. "Miss Vance, do you take this man as your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "And do you promise to honor him, support him, and stand by him in sickness and health?" Clara's voice was steady. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." Collins smiled. "You may kiss the bride." Ethan and Clara looked at each other. Neither of them had thought about this part. After a moment of awkward hesitation, Ethan leaned in and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It was over almost before it began, but something in Clara's expression shifted when he pulled back, a softening he hadn't seen before. Mrs. Keller clapped enthusiastically. "Congratulations. Now let's eat. I brought cake." They had an impromptu reception on the cabin's small porch, eating Mrs. Keller's cake and drinking the wine. The Reverend regaled them with stories from his circuit, and Mrs. Keller gossiped about the comings and goings at the way station. It was the closest thing to a celebration either Ethan or Clara had experienced in years. As the sun started to set, Mrs. Keller and Reverend Collins prepared to leave. Clara walked them to their horses, thanking them for coming. Ethan hung back, watching his wife. That word still felt strange in his head. Say goodbye to the two people who'd witnessed the strangest wedding he'd ever been part of. When they were gone and the valley fell quiet again, Clara came back to where he stood. "Well," she said, "we did it." "We did. What now?" Ethan looked at the cabin, at the work still left to do before winter set in hard. "Now we figure out how to make it work." Clara nodded slowly. Then, surprising him, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, roughened from labor, but they fit against his like they belonged there. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me a choice, for not asking me to be something I'm not." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for staying." They stood there as the stars came out, hands linked, two people who'd both run from different things and somehow ended up in the same place. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was honest, and that was something. The first real test came 2 weeks later. Ethan was in the corral working with a new horse he'd traded for when he heard Clara cry out from the cabin. He dropped the lead rope and ran, heart hammering, bursting through the door to find her standing frozen in the middle of the room. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Clara pointed to the window with a shaking hand. "Someone's coming." Ethan looked out and saw a rider approaching from the east, still too far away to identify. Could be anyone. Trapper, maybe, or... "It's him." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "It's James." Ethan's blood went cold. He looked again at the approaching rider, and this time he could make out more details. A broad-shouldered man on a chestnut horse, riding with the easy confidence of someone who owned the world. "You sure?" "I'm sure." Clara backed away from the window, her breathing coming fast. "What do we do?" Ethan's mind raced. They were married now. Clara was his wife, legally and officially. James had no claim on her, but he also knew how men like James operated. They didn't care about legalities when they decided they wanted something back. "You stay inside," he said. "Keep Thomas quiet. Let me handle this." "Ethan, trust me." He met her eyes. "I won't let him take you." Clara nodded, scooping up Thomas and retreating to the far corner of the cabin. Ethan checked his pistol, made sure it was loaded, and went outside to meet the man who'd abandoned his wife and child. James Vance reined in his horse about 20 feet from the cabin, looking around with an expression of casual interest. He was handsome in a rough sort of way, with dark hair and the kind of smile that probably charmed people until they figured out what was behind it. "Help you?" Ethan called out. James's smile widened. "Looking for my wife. Heard she might be around these parts." "Your wife?" "Clara Vance, pretty thing, dark hair, probably has a baby with her." James dismounted, his movements relaxed. "You seen her?" Ethan kept his hand near his pistol. "What makes you think she'd be here?" "Asked around. Someone at the way station said a woman matching her description was at a wedding a couple weeks back. Figured I'd check it out." James took a step closer. "So, have you seen her or not?" "I've seen her." Something shifted in James's expression. "Where is she?" "Safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Clara's not your wife anymore. She's mine." James went very still. "Excuse me? We got married, legal and proper, which means you got no claim on her." For a moment, James just stared at him. Then he laughed, a sharp bark of sound with no humor in it. "You married my wife. Your ex-wife. You left her, abandoned her at a burned homestead with nothing but a baby and broken promises. She's not yours anymore." James's smile disappeared. "Where is she?" "Inside, and she's staying there. That's my son in there. That's her son." Ethan didn't blink. "You gave up any right to him when you walked away." James's hand drifted toward his own pistol. Ethan's grip tightened on his, the threat clear. They stood facing each other, the tension thick enough to choke on. "You don't know what you're getting into," James said, his voice low and dangerous. "Clara's got a history. She's not what you think. I know exactly who she is. And I know what you did, which means we're done talking." Ethan took a step forward. "You can turn around and ride out, or we can settle this another way. Your choice." James looked past him at the cabin, and Ethan knew he was calculating odds, trying to figure out if he could get past him to Clara. But Ethan had positioned himself squarely in the path, and his hand was steady on his pistol in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. "This isn't over," James said finally. "Yes," Ethan said. "It is." They stared at each other for another long moment. Then James swung back onto his horse, his expression dark with fury. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it." James wheeled his horse around and rode off, not looking back. Ethan stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he turned back to the cabin, Clara was standing in the doorway with Thomas in her arms. Her face was pale, but composed. "Is he gone?" she asked. "He's gone." She nodded, then slowly sank down to sit on the porch step, like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Ethan sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," Clara said after a long silence. "For what?" "For not asking if I wanted to go with him. For just standing there and making the choice for both of us." Ethan looked at her profile, the tension still visible in the set of her jaw. "You would have gone?" "No?" The answer was immediate and certain. "But it would have hurt to have to say it, to have to choose between the promise I made to him and the life I'm building here." She turned to face him. "You took that choice away. Made it simple. Wasn't trying to take anything from you." "I know, but sometimes simple is exactly what you need." Clara shifted Thomas in her arms. "He'll come back." "Maybe." "Definitely. James doesn't like losing. Doesn't matter if he actually wanted me. What matters is someone else has me now." Ethan considered this. "Then we'll be ready." Clara looked at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that might have been the beginning of trust. Not the wary kind, not the tentative kind, but real trust. The kind that came from watching someone stand between you and the thing you feared most. "Yeah," she said quietly. "We will." They sat there together as the sun dropped below the mountains, neither of them willing to go back inside just yet, as if staying out here kept the reality of what had just happened at a distance. But eventually the cold drove them in, and they locked the door behind them and tried to pretend everything was fine. But that night, for the first time since Clara had arrived, Ethan didn't sleep on the floor. He climbed up to the loft where she'd been sleeping, and without a word, they lay down on opposite sides of the narrow bed, a careful distance between them. Not touching, not intimate, but together in a way that felt like it mattered. And when Clara's breathing finally evened out into sleep, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into and why. Despite everything, he didn't regret it. James didn't come back the next day, or the day after that, but his presence hung over the cabin like smoke that wouldn't clear. Clara jumped at every sound, a branch breaking, the horses shifting in the corral, wind rattling the shutters. She'd been learning to relax into the rhythms of their life, but now she moved through the days wound tight again, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for impact. Ethan watched her retreat into herself and didn't know how to pull her back out. He kept the rifle closer, checked the perimeter more often, made sure the door was barred at night. But those were practical measures against a practical threat. What he couldn't fight was the fear that had burrowed back into Clara's bones. 3 days after James's visit, Ethan was chopping wood when he heard Clara's voice from inside the cabin, sharp and strained. He dropped the axe and went in to find her sitting at the table, staring at a piece of paper like it might bite her. "What is it?" he asked. She held up the paper without looking at him. Her hand was shaking. "It was under the door when I got up this morning." Ethan took it, his jaw tightening as he read the scrawled message. "You think you can keep what's mine? Think again. This isn't over, Clara. Not by a long shot." "He came here," Clara said, her voice hollow, "while we were sleeping. He was right outside and we didn't even know." Ethan crumpled the paper in his fist, anger burning hot in his chest. "I'm going after him." "No." Clara stood abruptly. "That's what he wants. He wants you to leave me alone so he can—" She stopped, pressing her hands to her face. "I can't do this again. I can't sit here waiting for something terrible to happen." "Then what do you want to do?" Clara lowered her hands, and her eyes were hard. "I want to stop running. I want to stop being the thing men fight over like I don't get a say in it." She moved to the window, staring out at the valley. "My whole life, people have been making decisions for me. My father decided I couldn't marry James. James decided we'd come out here. You decided you'd stand between me and him yesterday." She turned to face Ethan. "And I appreciate it. I do. But I'm tired of being protected. I need to face him myself." Ethan felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. "You want to talk to him? I want to end this. On my terms." Clara's voice was steady now, certain. "He thinks he can scare me into coming back, or punish you for taking what he sees as his, but I'm not his. I never really was. And how exactly do you plan to end it?" "By telling him the truth." Clara crossed to the table, picked up Thomas, who'd been sleeping in his basket. "All of it. Everything I've been too afraid to say." Ethan studied her face, seeing the determination there, but also the fear she was trying to bury. "You don't owe him the truth." "I don't owe him anything, but I owe it to myself." She looked down at Thomas. "And to him. He deserves to know his mother isn't going to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder." It was hard to argue with that kind of resolve, even though every instinct Ethan had was screaming at him to lock the door and keep Clara inside until James gave up and moved on. But he'd meant what he said about not making decisions for her, about this being a partnership. If she needed to face James, he'd let her, but he wouldn't let her do it alone. "All right," he said, "but I'm coming with you." "Ethan, non-negotiable. You want to talk to him? Talk to him, but I'm not letting you ride out there by yourself." He held up a hand before she could protest. "You said you're tired of being protected. Fine. Consider me backup. You do the talking, I stand there and make sure he doesn't try anything stupid." Clara considered this, then nodded slowly. "Okay." Finding James wasn't hard. Ethan asked around at the way station, and Mrs. Keller told him there was a man matching James's description who'd been staying at the old Hutchins place, an abandoned homestead about 10 miles east. He'd been there 3 days, drinking and causing trouble at the small trading post nearby. They left Thomas with Mrs. Keller, who clucked over the baby and promised to keep him safe. Clara kissed her son's forehead and handed him over with visible reluctance, but she didn't waver. The ride to the Hutchins place was tense and quiet. Clara sat straight in the saddle, her rifle across her lap, her face set in lines that reminded Ethan of the woman he'd found on that burned roof, closed off, unreachable. But there was something different now, something harder. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was choosing. The Hutchins homestead was a wreck, Half the roof caved in, walls sagging, the whole structure listing to one side like it was too tired to stand upright. James's horse was tied outside, and smoke came from the chimney, so someone was definitely inside. Ethan and Clara dismounted, tying their horses at a safe distance. Clara checked her rifle, more out of habit than need, then looked at Ethan. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." They approached the cabin together. Ethan knocked hard on the door, his hand resting on his pistol. After a moment, the door swung open and James stood there, looking like he'd spent the last 3 days drinking his way through whatever liquor he'd managed to acquire. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw unshaven, his clothes rumpled. "Well," he said, a mean smile spreading across his face, "look who came crawling back." "I'm not crawling anywhere," Clara said, her voice cutting through whatever James had been about to say next. "I'm here to talk." James's gaze flicked to Ethan. "With your guard dog." "With my husband," Clara corrected. "Who's here because I asked him to be? Now are you going to let me say what I came to say, or are you going to stand there making jokes that aren't funny?" Something flickered in James's expression. Surprise, maybe, at this version of Clara who didn't flinch from him. He stepped back, gesturing them inside with mock courtesy. The interior of the cabin was worse than the outside. Bottles littered the floor, dirty dishes piled in the corner, the whole place smelling of stale alcohol and neglect. Ethan's disgust must have shown on his face because James laughed. "Not up to your standards?" James asked. "Sorry, didn't have time to clean before company arrived." "Sit down," Clara said, ignoring the jab. "We need to talk." James dropped into a chair near the cold fireplace, sprawling like he owned the place. Ethan stayed near the door, positioning himself so he could see both James and Clara. Clara remained standing, her rifle now leaning against the wall within reach but not threatening. "So talk," James said. Clara took a breath, and Ethan could see her gathering herself. "I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back. Not now, not ever. That part of my life is over." "Because you married him?" James jerked his chin toward Ethan. "That what you tell yourself to sleep better at night?" "No. Because you left me." Clara's voice didn't waver. "You walked away and told me to wait, and I did. I waited in that cabin while the money ran out, while the supplies dwindled, while I had a baby by myself with no one to help me. I waited until lightning struck the barn and fire spread to the house, and I was too exhausted and too broken to put it out. I waited until I had nothing left but ash and a child I didn't know how to feed. I was coming back." "You weren't," Clara cut him off. "If you were coming back, you would have been there. You would have sent word, sent money, sent something other than silence. But you didn't because you never intended to come back. You just told me to wait so you wouldn't have to feel guilty about leaving." James's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Clara took a step closer. "How long were you planning to stay gone, James? How long before you found another woman in another town and forgot you had a wife at all? That's not... And when exactly were you going to tell me about the debt you owed in Coulter's Bend? The gambling debts you ran from?" James went very still. Ethan watched him carefully, seeing the confirmation in the way his shoulders tensed. "I talked to people," Clara continued, "after you left. The clerk at the land office told me you'd been borrowing money you couldn't pay back, making bets you couldn't cover. That you disappeared the same week someone came looking for payment. You didn't leave to find opportunity, James. You left to save your own skin." "That's a lie." "It's the truth. The truth you never bothered to tell me because you knew I'd see you for what you really are, a coward who runs when things get hard." James stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. Ethan's hand moved to his pistol, but Clara held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not done," she said to James. "I don't have to listen to this." "Yes, you do, because I have something else to tell you." Clara's voice went quieter, but no less firm. "Thomas isn't your son." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. James stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been hurt. "What?" "He's not yours," Clara repeated. "His father is a man named Samuel, a clerk in Coulter's Bend who showed me kindness when you left me sitting in that office for hours while you chased your next scheme. It happened once, and I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either, because Thomas is the only good thing that came from my time with you." James's face had gone pale. You're lying. I'm not. And deep down, you know it. You've always known something was wrong. That's why you left when I told you I was pregnant. That's why you kept finding reasons to stay away. You... James's hands clenched into fists. You cheated on me. I was lonely and scared, and you were never there. Clara's voice hardened. Don't you dare stand there and act wounded when you abandoned me first in every way that mattered. Ethan watched James struggle with this information, saw the rage building behind his eyes. He tensed, ready to step in if James made a move toward Clara. But Clara wasn't done. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to leave. You're going to ride out of here and never come back. You're going to stop sending threatening notes. Stop showing up at our home. Stop thinking you have any claim on me or my son. Your son, James repeated bitterly. My son, Clara confirmed. Not yours. Not Samuel's. Mine. And Ethan's now, since he's the one who's actually willing to raise him. And if I don't leave? James asked, his voice dangerous. What then? Clara met his gaze without flinching. Then I go to the sheriff in Bridger's Point and tell him about the money you stole from the land office, about the forged documents you used to file claims on property that wasn't yours, about the debts you're running from. Ethan felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't known about any of that. But Clara's expression was certain, and James's reaction told him it was true. You wouldn't, James said, but there was no conviction in it. Try me. Clara's voice was cold. I spent months protecting you, lying for you, covering up your mistakes, because I thought that's what a wife was supposed to do. But I'm not your wife anymore. I'm not protecting you. If you don't leave us alone, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. James looked between Clara and Ethan, calculation in his eyes. Ethan could see him weighing his options, trying to figure out if Clara was bluffing. But there was nothing uncertain in her stance, nothing that suggested she wouldn't follow through. Finally, James laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You really think you're better off with him, a man you barely know? I know him better than I ever knew you, Clara said. He's honest. He keeps his promises. He doesn't run when things get difficult. That's more than I can say for you. James shook his head, still smiling that mean smile. Fine. You want him? Have him. See how long it lasts when he realizes what he's really got. A woman who spreads her legs for any man who shows her a little attention. Ethan moved before he'd fully decided to, crossing the room in 3 strides and grabbing James by the collar. Watch your mouth. James tried to pull away, but Ethan's grip was iron. Or what? You'll shoot me in front of her? I don't need to shoot you, Ethan said quietly. Just need to remind you that you're talking about my wife. And if you insult her again, we'll finish this conversation outside where there are no witnesses. For a moment, they stood locked together, Ethan's knuckles white on James's collar, James's face red with anger and humiliation. Then Clara's voice cut through the tension. Let him go, Ethan. Ethan held on a second longer, making his point, then released James with a shove that sent him stumbling back. James caught himself on the wall, breathing hard. We're done here, Clara said. You have until tomorrow to clear out. After that, I'm going to the sheriff. She turned and walked out of the cabin, her back straight, her head high. Ethan followed, keeping himself between her and James until they were outside. James didn't follow, didn't call after them. When Ethan glanced back, he was standing in the doorway, watching them leave with an expression that was impossible to read. They rode in silence for the first mile. Clara's hands were steady on the reins, her face composed, but Ethan could see the tremor running through her shoulders. You all right? He asked. No, Clara said, but I will be. What you said in there, about the money, the forged documents. That all true? Most of it. Clara glanced at him. I exaggerated some parts, but there's enough truth that he'll worry. Ethan felt something like admiration stir in his chest. You played him. I learned from the best. The bitter edge was back in her voice. James taught me a lot about lying. Figured I might as well put those lessons to use. They rode a bit further before Ethan spoke again. Thomas's father, Samuel. You ever think about trying to find him? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes. When Thomas does something new, says a sound that's almost a word, I wonder if Samuel would want to know. If he'd care. She shook her head. But then I remember that he doesn't know Thomas exists. And even if he did, What would I say? Here's the child I never told you about, the result of one afternoon when I was lonely and foolish? Might be he'd understand. Or he'd feel trapped, just like James did. Clara looked at Ethan. I don't want Thomas to be something anyone feels trapped by. I want him to be chosen, the way you've chosen him. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. The weight of it settled over him, the responsibility of raising another man's child, of being the one who stayed when others had left. It should have felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like purpose. I meant what I said in there, he told Clara, about being honest, keeping promises. I'm not going anywhere. You don't know that. Things could change. They could, Ethan agreed, but I'm still not going anywhere. That's what a promise is, saying you'll stay even when you don't know what's coming. Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Gratitude mixed with something raw, more vulnerable. I don't deserve you. That's not how this works. We don't earn each other. We just choose each other and hope it's enough. They collected Thomas from Mrs. Keller, who asked how it went with knowing eyes but didn't push for details. The ride back to the cabin felt different than the ride out, lighter somehow, like Clara had set down something heavy and was still getting used to the absence of its weight. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they'd eaten a quiet dinner, Clara did something she'd never done before. She crossed to where Ethan sat by the fire and settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thank you, she said. For what? For letting me do that my way. For not fighting him for me, even though I know you wanted to. Ethan looked at her profile, the way the firelight caught in her hair. Wasn't my fight to have. Most men wouldn't see it that way. I'm not most men. Clara turned to face him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not love, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes from seeing someone clearly and deciding they're worth the risk. No, she agreed. You're not. She leaned in slowly, giving him time to pull back, and kissed him. It was different from the brief, awkward kiss at their wedding. This one was deliberate, searching, like she was asking a question and waiting to see how he'd answer. Ethan answered by cupping her face in his hands and kissing her back. Not desperately, not with the heat of passion, but with steady warmth. A promise made without words. When they pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? Of this. Of letting myself want it. Every time I've wanted something, it's been taken away. Ethan's thumb traced her cheekbone. I can't promise nothing will take this away. Can't promise we won't mess it up or that life won't get hard. But I can promise I'll be here tomorrow. And the day after that? And the day after that? Until when? Until one of us isn't here anymore. That's the only endpoint I'm willing to accept. Clara's breath hitched, and when she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes. But she was smiling, actually smiling, the kind that reached her eyes and made her look younger, less worn. Okay, she said. Okay. That night, when they climbed to the loft, the careful distance between them was gone. They lay facing each other in the narrow bed, Claire's hand resting on Ethan's chest, his arm around her shoulders. It wasn't about desire, not yet, maybe not for a while. It was about proximity, about choosing to be close to another person despite all the risks that came with it. Ethan lay awake long after Clara's breathing had evened into sleep, staring at the darkness and thinking about all the ways he'd spent years protecting himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. How he'd built a life designed to keep people at a distance, convinced that solitude was the only way to avoid being hurt. But lying there with Clara warm against his side, Thomas sleeping in his basket below, the cabin quiet around them, he realized something. Solitude hadn't protected him from pain. It had just guaranteed he'd face it alone. The next week passed without incident. No sign of James, no threatening notes, no riders approaching from the east. Clara started to relax again, the tension in her shoulders gradually unwinding. She laughed more, not the bitter, sharp laughter from before, but something genuine. She sang to Thomas while she worked, old songs Ethan didn't recognize. She touched Ethan more casually, a hand on his arm when she passed, fingers brushing his when they both reached for the same tool. It was a kind of domesticity Ethan had never experienced. His parents' marriage had been functional but cold, all duty and no warmth. Margaret had wanted a romance from a storybook, something Ethan had never been capable of providing. But this thing with Clara, it was honest in a way that felt revolutionary. They didn't pretend to be perfect. They just showed up for each other day after day, building something from scratch. 2 weeks after the confrontation with James, Clara found Ethan in the barn and handed him a piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "A letter. To my mother." Clara's voice was tentative. "I've been thinking about what you said about the bridges I burned. I want to try rebuilding at least one of them." Ethan scanned the letter. It was honest without being cruel, explaining where Clara was, what had happened, how she'd found a new life. It asked about her mother's health, mentioned Thomas, talked about Ethan in terms that made his chest feel tight. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No, but I'm tired of running from my past. If I'm really starting over, I need to at least try to make peace with where I came from." Ethan folded the letter carefully. "I'll take it to town tomorrow. Post it for you." Clara nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else, something I need to tell you." Ethan waited, seeing the struggle on her face. "My name's not Clara Vance," she said finally. "It's Clara Hartley. I never legally married James. We went through a ceremony, but he never filed the papers. Said he'd do it later and then never did." Ethan processed this. "So when we got married, it was my first real marriage. First time my name actually changed legally." Clara looked down at her hands. "I kept waiting for you to find out, to realize I'd lied about who I was. But you never asked, never checked. You just trusted me. You had your reasons for using his name. Doesn't change anything for me." "It should. I lied to you." "No," Ethan said carefully. "You protected yourself. There's a difference." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Why aren't you angry?" "Because I understand. Because we've all done things to survive that we're not proud of. Because getting angry about the past seems like a waste of time when we could be building a future." He reached out, tilting her chin up so she had to look at him. "Your name is Clara Ryder now. That's the only name that matters to me." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "Clara Ryder, I'm still not used to it. You'll have time to get used to it. We've got nothing but time." She kissed him then, hard and sudden, like she was trying to communicate something she didn't have words for. Ethan kissed her back, his hands settling on her waist, pulling her closer. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara's expression was different, less guarded, more open. "Come to bed," she said quietly. "Actually come to bed, not just to sleep." Ethan searched her face. "You sure?" "I'm sure. I want this. I want you. Not because I need protecting or because I'm grateful. Because I choose you." It was the choosing that mattered. The deliberate decision to be vulnerable, to trust, to let someone in. They went to the loft together, and for the first time their marriage became something more than an arrangement. It became a real partnership, built on honesty and choice, and the kind of courage it took to try again after being broken. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Clara spoke into the silence. "I think I'm starting to love you." Ethan's hand stilled on her back. "You think? I don't know what love is supposed to feel like. But this? Lying here with you, knowing you'll be here tomorrow, feeling safe for the first time in years? If that's not love, it's close enough that I don't care about the difference." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Close enough for me, too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. Two people who'd both learned to survive alone, figuring out how to live together. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future didn't look like something to fear. It looked like something worth building toward. But peace, Ethan had learned, was always temporary on the frontier. 3 days later, he was in town picking up supplies when he heard the news. James Vance had been found dead 20 miles south, shot in the back. And the man they'd arrested for it was claiming self-defense, saying James had tried to rob him. Ethan rode back faster than he should have, his mind racing. When he reached the cabin, Clara was outside hanging laundry, Thomas playing in the grass at her feet. She looked up as he approached, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "What happened?" "James is dead." Clara went very still. The shirt she'd been hanging slipped from her fingers. "How?" Ethan told her what he'd heard. Clara listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I should feel something," she said finally. Relief or grief or guilt, something. But all I feel is empty. Like he was already gone and this is just making it official. That's normal, Ethan said, though he had no idea if it was true. Is it? What kind of person doesn't cry when their husband, when someone they were married to, dies? The kind who already mourned him a long time ago. Ethan dismounted, moving to stand beside her. You don't owe him your tears, Clara. You don't owe him anything. Clara picked up the shirt she'd dropped, smoothing it with shaking hands. He was a terrible husband, a coward and a liar and a cheat. But he wasn't always like that. When I first met him, he was charming, full of dreams. I fell in love with those dreams. She looked at Ethan. Maybe that's what I'm mourning. Not the man he was, but the man I thought he could be. That's fair. Do we need to do anything? For the burial, or... He's got no family that anyone knows of. The town will handle it. Ethan paused. Unless you want to be there. Clara shook her head immediately. No. That part of my life is over. I don't need to stand over his grave to know it. She went back to hanging laundry, her movements mechanical. Ethan watched her for a moment, then went inside to check on Thomas. The baby was drowsy, fighting sleep, his small fist wrapped around the edge of his blanket. Ethan picked him up carefully, settling into the chair by the window. Thomas blinked up at him with dark eyes that would probably never know the man whose name he'd been given. Ethan thought about all the ways a child could be shaped by the adults around them, all the things that got passed down, good and bad, intentional and accidental. Your mama's stronger than she knows, he said softly to the baby. And you're going to grow up seeing that. Going to learn from it. Learn that strength isn't about never being afraid or never making mistakes. It's about getting back up after you fall, about choosing to keep going even when it's hard. Thomas yawned, his eyes drifting closed. Ethan kept rocking, kept talking, pouring out all the things he wanted this child to know, to be, to understand. Things his own father had never said to him. Outside, Clara finished the laundry and came back in. She stopped in the doorway, watching Ethan with Thomas, and something in her expression cracked open. What? Ethan asked. Nothing, just, you're good with him. He's easy, just eats and sleeps and occasionally makes a mess. No, I mean, Clara crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the chair's arm. You didn't have to do any of this. Take us in, marry me, raise another man's child. You chose all of it, and I don't think I've really let myself understand what that means until right now. Ethan looked down at Thomas, then back at Clara. Means I made a choice and I'm standing by it. Same as you. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that. A small family in a small cabin, bound together by choice rather than blood. Outside, the sun was setting over the valley, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. But tonight they had this, peace and quiet and each other. And for now, that was enough. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a cold that cut through layers and settled into bones. Ethan spent the weeks before the first snow preparing, cutting extra firewood, insulating the cabin walls with mud and straw, hunting and smoking meat until they had enough to last months if they needed it. Clara worked beside him, her hands rough and capable, never complaining even when the wind made her eyes water or her fingers went numb. Thomas was crawling now, getting into everything, and the cabin that had once felt spacious suddenly seemed too small for a curious baby determined to explore every corner. Clara sewed him warmer clothes from scraps of fabric, patted the sharp corners of furniture, spent half her day keeping him from danger he didn't understand yet. It was exhausting, relentless work, but it was also good. The kind of good that came from building something that mattered. The letter from Clara's mother arrived 3 weeks after the first snow, delivered by a rider who'd been paid extra to make the journey into the valley. Clara's hands shook as she opened it, her face pale with anticipation and fear. Ethan gave her space, taking Thomas outside to check on the horses while she read. When he came back inside, Clara was sitting at the table, the letter spread in front of her, tears streaming down her face. Ethan's stomach dropped. What'd she say? Clara looked up, and he realized the tears weren't from grief. She was smiling through them, her whole face transformed. She forgives me. She says she understands why I left, why I didn't write. She says my father forgave me too, before he died. That his last words were about hoping I'd found happiness. Ethan felt something tight in his chest loosen. That's good. She wants to meet you. And Thomas. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She's asking if we can visit in the spring, when the roads are clear. Says she's too old to travel herself, but she has money saved, enough to help us make the trip if we need it. You want to go? Clara hesitated. I don't know. Part of me does. But part of me is scared she'll take one look at my life and think I made a mistake. That I threw everything away for this. She gestured around the cabin at the rough walls and simple furniture. Ethan sat down across from her. Did you throw everything away? No. The answer came immediately. No, I didn't. I found something better, something real. Then that's what you tell her. And if she can't see it, that's her loss, not yours. Clara reached across the table, taking his hand. Come with me, when we go. I need you there. Wasn't planning on letting you go alone. I don't mean just for protection. I mean, Clara struggled for the words. I need her to see us together, to understand that this isn't me settling or making do. This is me choosing the life I actually want. Ethan squeezed her hand. Then I'll be there. They spent the winter planning for the trip, saving money from the furs Ethan trapped, making lists of what they'd need for the journey. But more than that, they spent it learning each other in ways they hadn't before. The forced proximity of winter meant there was nowhere to hide, no way to avoid the small irritations and conflicts that came from two people living in close quarters. Clara had a temper Ethan hadn't seen before, quick to flare when she was tired or frustrated, sharp words flying before she'd thought them through. Ethan had a tendency to shut down when things got difficult, retreating into silence that made Clara feel like she was talking to a wall. They fought about stupid things, how to stack the firewood, whether Thomas needed another blanket, whose turn it was to cook. But they also learned how to fight fair, how to say sorry when they'd been wrong, how to listen even when they didn't want to, how to give each other space without it meaning abandonment. It wasn't pretty or smooth. There were nights when they went to bed angry, backs turned to each other in the narrow loft. But there were also mornings when they woke tangled together and couldn't remember what they'd fought about, only that they'd worked through it. One particularly bitter night in January, after Thomas had finally fallen asleep following hours of teething-induced crying, Clara and Ethan sat by the fire, both exhausted. I yelled at him today, Clara said quietly. Thomas, he wouldn't stop crying and I was so tired and I just yelled, like it was his fault for being a baby. Ethan looked at her. What happened? He looked at me with these big scared eyes and cried harder, and I felt like the worst mother in the world. Her voice cracked. What if I'm just like my father? He used to yell at me when I was young, and I swore I'd never do that to my own child. But here I am, doing exactly the same thing. You're not your father, Ethan said firmly. Your father yelled at you for existing, for being inconvenient. You yelled because you're human and exhausted and doing the best you can with a situation that's hard. There's a difference. Is there? Yeah. Because you feel bad about it, because you're sitting here worrying you've damaged him instead of justifying it. Ethan moved closer. Good parents make mistakes. The difference is they care that they made them. Clara leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. They sat in silence for a while, listening to Thomas's soft breathing from the corner where he slept. I'm scared I'm going to mess him up, Clara said. That all my mistakes, all the things I've done wrong, they're going to shape him in ways I can't fix. Probably will, Ethan said honestly. But that's not the same as ruining him. We're all shaped by our parents' mistakes. The question is what we do with it. What do you do with it? With what your parents did wrong? Ethan considered this. My father was a hard man. Fair, but hard. He believed in earning everything, never showing weakness, never asking for help. Took me years to realize that wasn't strength. It was fear. Fear of being vulnerable, of needing anyone. He paused. I spent my whole adult life repeating that pattern until I met you. Until I had to choose between staying alone and taking a risk. And which are you doing now? Staying alone or taking a risk? Both, I guess. I'm alone with you. Taking the risk that this thing between us is worth protecting. Clara tilted her head to look at him. Do you regret it? The risk? Not once, Ethan said, and meant it. She kissed him then, soft and slow, and they went to bed not talking about mistakes or fear, but about the small moments of grace that made the hard parts bearable. By February, Thomas had learned to pull himself up on furniture, wobbling on unsteady legs and grinning like he'd conquered the world. Clara spent half her time catching him before he fell, the other half watching him with an expression of such fierce love it made Ethan's throat tight. He found himself doing the same thing, watching Clara when she didn't know he was looking. The way she hummed while she worked, the crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she was concentrating, the soft smile she got when Thomas did something new. He was learning her the way a person learns a landscape, slowly, with attention to detail, finding beauty in unexpected places. One evening, as they were getting ready for bed, Clara caught him staring. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Nothing. Just looking." "At what?" "You." Ethan crossed to where she stood, trying to figure out when this happened. "When what happened?" "When I stopped being able to imagine my life without you in it." Clara's expression softened. "You're not supposed to be romantic. You're supposed to be practical and gruff." "I can be both." He pulled her close. "Practically speaking, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Gruffly speaking, I love you." Clara laughed, the sound filling the small space. "That might be the worst declaration of love I've ever heard." "Yeah, well, I'm out of practice." "Say it again, without the gruff part." Ethan cupped her face in his hands, looking into eyes that had once been so empty and now held warmth and life and trust. "I love you, Clara. The messy, complicated, imperfect reality of you. I love the way you refuse to give up even when things are hard. I love watching you be a mother to Thomas. I love that you're stubborn and smart and you don't need me to save you. You just let me stand beside you while you save yourself." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since the day you climbed up on that roof and made me come down. Since you gave me a choice when everyone else in my life just gave me orders." They made love that night with a tenderness that came from truly knowing each other, from having seen each other at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. And afterward, lying in the dark with Clara's head on his chest, Ethan felt something he'd thought he'd lost the capacity for. Contentment. Not happiness. That was too bright, too fragile. But contentment. The deep satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. March brought the thaw, the snow melting into streams that rushed down from the mountains. The valley turned green seemingly overnight, wildflowers pushing up through the mud, birds returning to build nests in the eaves of the cabin. It was beautiful and brutal all at once, the way spring always was, full of promise but also relentless work. They started preparing for the trip to Virginia in earnest. Ethan sold some furs, traded others for supplies they'd need. Clara sewed traveling clothes for herself and Thomas, mended Ethan's good shirt, packed and repacked their bags a dozen times. The nervousness came back, hovering around her like a shadow, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't fear of the past catching up to her. It was hope for something better, and hope was always scarier than fear. 2 weeks before they planned to leave, Mrs. Keller came by with news from town. She looked troubled, which was unusual for her. "There's talk," she said, settling at the table with the tea Clara had poured. "About you too." Ethan felt Clara stiffen beside him. "What kind of talk?" "The unkind kind. Some folks saying Clara got James killed so she could marry you. Others saying you two were carrying on before James died, and that's why he left in the first place." Mrs. Keller's face was apologetic. "I don't believe a word of it, mind you, but I thought you should know what people are saying." Clara's face had gone pale. "Who's saying this?" "Mostly men from the trading post who knew James. They're stirring up trouble, claiming you owe them money James borrowed, saying they'll take it out of your property if you don't pay." Ethan's jaw tightened. "James's debts aren't our problem. That's what I told them, but they're not interested in logic. They want someone to blame, and you two are convenient." Mrs. Keller reached across the table, patting Clara's hand. "I'd watch your back if I were you, and maybe postpone your trip until this blows over." After Mrs. Keller left, Clara was quiet for a long time. Ethan could see her thinking, calculating, that sharp intelligence working through the problem. "We're not postponing," she said finally. "Clara." "No, and I've spent my whole life letting other people's opinions dictate what I do. I'm not doing it anymore." She stood, pacing to the window. "These men want to use me as a scapegoat for James's failures. They want to turn me into the villain of a story I didn't even write. But I'm done being written by other people. So what do you want to do? Clara turned to face him. I want to go into town and face them. I want to tell them exactly who James was and what he did. I want to make sure everyone knows the truth so these lies don't follow us. Ethan stood. That's dangerous. These men are angry and looking for a target. You walk into town and give them a speech. It might not go the way you're hoping. Maybe. But hiding here isn't going to make them stop. And I won't leave for Virginia with this hanging over us, worrying the whole time that they're spreading poison about us to anyone who'll listen. Ethan studied her face, seeing the determination there, but also the fear she was working hard to hide. Then we go together. You want to tell your story? Fine. But I'm right there with you. They rode into town 3 days later, Thomas strapped to Clara's chest in the sling she'd made. The trading post was busy, men gathered outside drinking and talking. The conversation died when Ethan and Clara rode up, all eyes turning to watch them. Clara dismounted first, her chin high, her back straight. Ethan followed, positioning himself slightly behind her but ready to move if things turned violent. I hear there's been talk about me, Clara said, her voice carrying across the silence. So I figured I'd come give you all the truth instead of letting you make up your own stories. A man Ethan recognized from previous trips stepped forward, tall, with a scar running down his left cheek. You got some nerve showing your face here. I've got plenty of nerve, Clara shot back. What I don't have is patience for lies. So let's clear something up right now. James Vance was a liar, a cheat, and a coward. He married me without filing the papers, left me pregnant and alone, and ran from debts he never intended to pay. When he died running from the consequences of his own choices. I didn't kill him. I didn't even mourn him. And I sure as hell don't owe any of you money for loans you were stupid enough to give a man with no intention of paying you back. Murmurs ran through the crowd. The scarred man's face darkened. You think you can just... I think I can tell the truth and let you deal with it however you want, Clara interrupted. But here's something else you should know. I'm leaving in 2 weeks to visit my family back east. When I come back, I expect this to be done. No more rumors, no more threats, no more showing up at my home trying to collect debts that aren't mine. You want to be angry at someone. Be angry at James. He's the one who took your money. He's the one who lied to you. I'm just the woman he left behind. And him? Someone pointed at Ethan. What's his part in this? He's my husband, Clara said simply. The man I chose to marry after James abandoned me. The man who's helped me build a life worth living. That's his part. Nothing more, nothing less. The crowd was restless, hostile. Ethan could feel the mood shifting, teetering on the edge of something ugly. His hand moved to his pistol, ready. But then Mrs. Keller emerged from the trading post, wiping her hands on her apron. She's telling the truth, the older woman said loudly. I knew James Vance. He was no good then and he was no good when he died. This girl here's done nothing but survive what he put her through. Anyone's got a problem with that can take it up with me. Another voice joined hers, the blacksmith, a man Ethan had traded with before. Mrs. Keller's right. James owed me money too, but I'm not fool enough to think his widow should pay for it. Man makes his own debts. Slowly, reluctantly, others began nodding. Not everyone. There were still angry faces in the crowd, men who wanted someone to blame and didn't much care if it was fair. But enough people spoke up in support that the mob mentality started to fracture. The scarred man spat into the dirt. This ain't over. Yeah, Clara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. It is. And if you come near my family again, you'll answer to more than just my husband. You'll answer to every person in this town who knows the difference between justice and spite. She turned and mounted her horse in one fluid motion, not waiting to see if the crowd would accept her words or reject them. Ethan followed, keeping himself between Clara and the angry men until they were clear of town. They rode in silence for a mile before Clara finally spoke. That was stupid. Yeah, Ethan agreed. It was. But necessary. Maybe. Clara looked at him, and there was something fierce and bright in her expression. I'm tired of running from who I am, tired of letting shame dictate what I say and do. If people want to hate me for surviving, let them hate me. At least they'll hate the truth instead of a lie. Ethan felt pride swell in his chest. You were magnificent. I was terrified. Doesn't make it less magnificent. He reached over, taking her hand. I'm proud of you. Clara squeezed his fingers. Thank you for letting me do that, for not trying to protect me from it. You don't need protecting. You need someone who trusts you to fight your own battles. Even when they scare you? Especially then. They rode home together, the spring sun warm on their faces, Thomas sleeping peacefully against Clara's chest. Behind them, the town and its judgment fell away. Ahead, the valley opened up, green and welcoming, the cabin waiting with smoke rising from its chimney. That night, after Thomas was asleep and they'd eaten dinner, Clara pulled out the letter from her mother and read it again. "What if she's disappointed?" she asked. "What if she looks at this life and thinks I could have done better?" Ethan set down the harness he was mending. "Then she doesn't understand what better really means." "What does it mean?" "Means waking up and choosing to be there. Means building something with your own hands instead of inheriting something built by someone else. Means loving someone not because they're perfect, but because they're real." He crossed to where she sat. "You want my opinion? I think your mother's going to take one look at you and see exactly what I see. A woman who survived hell and came out stronger for it." Clara looked up at him with eyes that were learning how to hope again. "And what if I'm not strong enough? What if I get there and fall apart? Then you fall apart, and I'll be there to help put you back together. That's what we do now. We catch each other." She stood, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. Ethan held her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his, and thought about all the ways they'd both changed since that day he'd found her on a burned roof, waiting for someone who was never coming back. They weren't the same people anymore. Claire had stopped waiting and started choosing. Ethan had stopped running and started staying. Together, they'd built something neither of them had known they needed. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. Not a romance from a storybook, but a partnership forged in fire and tested by hardship. And that, Ethan thought, was worth more than all the pretty promises in the world. 2 weeks later, they loaded their belongings onto the wagon Ethan had traded for, secured Thomas in the nest Clara had made for him, and started the long journey east. The valley fell away behind them, the cabin growing smaller until it disappeared from view. But neither of them looked back with regret. They were moving forward, together, toward whatever came next. And for the first time in both their lives, the future didn't look like something to fear or flee from. It looked like something they were building with their own hands, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one step at a time. Together. The journey east took 3 weeks, and every mile felt like traveling backward through Clara's life. They passed through towns she'd seen on the way west with James, places that had seemed full of possibility then, and now just looked small and worn. The landscape changed from open prairie to rolling hills to the dense forests of Virginia, and with each passing day, Clara felt the weight of her past settling heavier on her shoulders. Thomas handled the travel better than expected, content to sleep in his nest or watch the world roll by with wide, curious eyes. But the constant motion wore on all of them. Ethan's back ached from sitting on the wagon bench, Clara's nerves frayed from worry about what waited at the end of the road, and by the time they reached the outskirts of Richmond, they were all exhausted. Clara's mother lived in a small house on the edge of town, the same place Clara had grown up. As they turned down the familiar street, Clara's hands started shaking. "You want to wait?" Ethan asked. "Go to a hotel? Get cleaned up first?" "No." Clara's voice was tight. "If I wait, I'll lose my nerve." They pulled up in front of a narrow house with peeling paint and a small garden out front. Clara sat frozen, staring at the door she'd walked out of 5 years ago, convinced she'd never return. Ethan reached over, covering her hand with his. "I'm right here." Clara nodded, took a breath, and climbed down from the wagon. She lifted Thomas from his nest, holding him like a shield, and walked up the 3 steps to the front door. Her hand hovered over the knocker for a long moment before she finally let it fall. Footsteps inside. The sound of a lock turning. Then the door opened, and Clara was face to face with her mother for the first time in 5 years. Margaret Hartley had aged. Her hair was more gray than brown now, her face lined with years of worry and work. But her eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, missing nothing. They swept over Clara, taking in her worn traveling clothes, her work-roughened hands, the baby in her arms. Then they moved to Ethan, standing a few paces back, and lingered there for a moment before returning to Clara. "Mama," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face crumpled. She reached out, pulling Clara into a fierce embrace that made Thomas squawk in protest between them. "My girl," she said, her voice thick. My girl, you came home. Clara's carefully maintained composure shattered. She sobbed against her mother's shoulder, 5 years of grief and guilt and loneliness pouring out in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. Margaret held her, one hand stroking her hair like she was a child again, making soft, soothing sounds that meant nothing and everything. When Clara finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Margaret was smiling through her own tears. "Let me see him," she said, reaching for Thomas. Clara handed over her son, watching as her mother cradled the baby with the ease of long practice. Thomas stared up at this new face, then reached up to grab a handful of gray hair, making Margaret laugh. "He's beautiful," Margaret said. "Perfect." She looked at Clara. "And who's this?" Clara turned to where Ethan stood at the base of the steps, hat in hand, clearly uncomfortable. "This is Ethan, my husband." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "The one from your letter." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. Margaret studied him for a long moment, the kind of assessment only a mother could give. Ethan stood still under the scrutiny, not fidgeting, meeting her eyes with quiet respect. "You the one who found her?" Margaret asked. "Yes, ma'am." "The one who married her when she had nothing?" "I'm the one who was lucky enough she said yes." Margaret's lips twitched. "Smooth talker." "No, ma'am, just honest." Something in Margaret's expression softened. "Well, come in then, all of you. You look half-starved and completely worn out." The house was smaller than Clara remembered, cramped and dim, smelling of old wood and the lavender her mother had always grown in pots on the windowsill. But it was clean and warm, and when Margaret set Thomas down in the corner on a pile of cushions and started pulling out food, Clara felt something in her chest unclench. They ate at the small table where Clara had eaten 1,000 meals as a child. Margaret asked questions about the journey, about the valley, about how they'd met. Clara answered honestly, not hiding the hard parts, not prettying up the story. She told her mother about James's abandonment, about the fire, about Ethan climbing up to that roof. She told her about the marriage of convenience that had become something real, about facing James one last time, about choosing to build a life instead of waiting for one. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face betraying little of what she thought. When Clara finished, there was a long silence. "Your father," Margaret said finally, "he was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about James." Clara looked down at her plate. "I know, but he was also wrong to try to control you the way he did, to make you feel like you couldn't make your own choices." Margaret reached across the table, taking Clara's hand. "I was wrong too. I should have stood up for you, helped you see what James was without pushing you away. Instead, I let your father's anger become my own, and I lost you for it." "Mama, you don't have to. Let me finish." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I spent 5 years thinking you were gone forever. 5 years praying you were all right, that you'd found happiness, that wherever you were, you weren't alone. And then your letter came and I learned you'd been through hell and survived it, that you'd found a man who actually deserved you." She glanced at Ethan. "No offense?" "None taken," Ethan said. Margaret turned back to Clara. "What I'm trying to say is, I'm proud of you. For leaving when you needed to, for surviving when it got hard, for having the courage to write to me even though you had every reason not to. You're stronger than I ever was." Clara's throat tightened. "I don't feel strong. Strong people never do. That's how you know it's real." Margaret stood, moving to where Thomas was starting to fuss. She picked him up, settling him on her hip with practiced ease. "Now, you two look like you haven't slept in a proper bed in weeks. The spare room's made up. You'll stay here as long as you need." They stayed 3 weeks. Long enough for the exhaustion to fade, for Thomas to get used to his grandmother's face, for Clara to remember what it felt like to be someone's daughter. Long enough for Ethan to help Margaret fix the leaking roof and the broken step, and all the small things that had fallen into disrepair since Clara's father died. Long enough for the 3 of them, 4 counting Thomas, to become a family in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. Margaret told stories about Clara as a child, about the trouble she'd gotten into and the spirit she'd shown before life had tried to beat it out of her. Ethan listened, filing away these pieces of his wife's history, seeing her through her mother's eyes. Clara, in turn, asked about her father's last days, about the things he'd said before he died, and Margaret told her the truth, that he'd been stubborn and proud until the end. but that he'd also expressed regret for how he'd handled things with his daughter. "He said I should write to you if I ever found you," Margaret said one evening as they sat in the small parlor. "Said to tell you he was sorry for not understanding that your life was yours to live, not his to control." Clara wiped her eyes. "I wish I'd come back, before he died. I wish I'd had the chance to tell him I forgave him." "He knew," Margaret said softly. "Parents always know." On their last night in Richmond, Margaret pulled Clara aside while Ethan was putting Thomas to bed upstairs. "I want you to have something," she said, leading Clara to the small desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "Your father's life insurance. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to help you build a better life." Clara stared at the pouch. "Mama, I can't." "Yes, you can. It's yours. Your father would want you to have it, and so do I." Margaret pressed it into Clara's hands. "Use it to expand your cabin, buy livestock, whatever you need. Just promise me you'll use it to build something that lasts." His fingers closed around the pouch. "I promise." Margaret pulled her into a hug. "Come back and visit. Don't wait another 5 years. I want to watch my grandson grow up." "We will," Clara said, meaning it. "I promise." The journey back west felt different than the journey out. Lighter, somehow, despite the weight of the money hidden in their wagon. Clara had reconciled with her past in a way she hadn't thought possible. She'd faced her mother and found forgiveness instead of judgment. She'd introduced her son to his grandmother and given them both a connection that would last beyond distance. But more than that, she'd proven to herself that she could go back without being pulled into the past. That she could honor where she came from while still choosing where she was going. They traveled more slowly on the return, stopping at towns along the way, spending money from Margaret's gift on supplies they'd need, nails and tools, seeds for a bigger garden, chickens in cages that squawked and complained the whole way. They bought Thomas new clothes he'd grow into, fabric for Clara to make curtains for the cabin windows, a new rifle for Ethan to replace the one that was starting to show its age. They bought things for a future they were building together, and with each purchase, the life they'd left behind felt more real, more permanent. When they finally crested the last hill and looked down into the valley where their cabin waited, Clara felt something she'd never felt before. The bone-deep certainty that she was home. Not because it was where she'd been born or where she'd grown up, but because it was where she'd chosen to be. Where she and Ethan had built something with their own hands and their own choices. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, but also more solid. Ethan had built it well, and it had weathered the winter without them. They unloaded the wagon, carried in their supplies, and that first night back, they lay in their loft bed with Thomas between them and just breathed. "Feels different," Clara said quietly. "How so?" "Like it's really ours now. Before it felt like I was borrowing it, using it until something better came along or until the past caught up with me. But now," she trailed off, searching for the words. "Now it's home," Ethan finished. "Yeah." Clara looked over at him. "Thank you for coming with me, for meeting my mother, for helping her with the house, for—" "You don't have to thank me for that." "I do, though. You didn't have to care about my past or my family. You could have just stayed here and let me go alone." Ethan shifted onto his side, looking at her across Thomas's sleeping form. "Your past is part of you. Your family is part of you. Loving you means caring about the things that made you who you are." Clara's eyes filled. "When did you get so wise?" "When I met a woman who taught me that strength isn't about going it alone. It's about letting people in even when it's scary." They fell asleep like that, the three of them tangled together in the small bed. And when Clara woke the next morning to Thomas's demands for breakfast and Ethan's arm heavy across her waist, she felt something close to peace. The summer was busy in the way that frontier summers always were, planting, building, expanding. They used Margaret's money to buy lumber and built an addition onto the cabin, giving Thomas his own small room and them a little more space to breathe. Ethan constructed a proper chicken coop for the birds they'd brought back, and Clara started a larger garden, planting vegetables and herbs and even a few flowers just because they made her happy. They bought 2 cows and a breeding pair of pigs, investing in a future where they could be more self-sufficient. The work was hard, the days long, but there was satisfaction in it, in watching things grow, in building something that would last beyond them. Thomas learned to walk that summer, tottering around the cabin and the yard on unsteady legs, getting into everything, making them both laugh with his determination to explore. He said his first word, not mama or dada, but no, which Clara said was fitting given how much of his day was spent hearing it. They had neighbors now, too. A family named the Harpers had settled 10 miles south, and a bachelor named Joe Miller had claimed land to the west. They helped each other with big projects, barn raisings, fence building, harvesting. It wasn't exactly community, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. The sense that they weren't completely alone, that they were part of something larger than just themselves. In late August, Clara realized she was pregnant again. She told Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and then something like joy. "You sure?" he asked. "Pretty sure. I've been sick in the mornings, and I'm late, and—" She put a hand on her still flat stomach. "I just know." Ethan reached over, covering her hand with his. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Clara said honestly. "Thomas was so hard, and I did it mostly alone. But also—" She looked at him. "Also happy. Because this time I won't be alone. This time I'll have you." "You'll have me," Ethan promised, every step of the way. The pregnancy was different than Clara's first. She was older now, more tired, the work of the homestead never stopping even when she felt like she couldn't keep her eyes open. But she was also stronger, more confident in herself as a mother. And Ethan was there, taking on extra work without complaint, making sure she rested, helping with Thomas when Clara was too exhausted to do more than lie down. They argued more than they had before, short-tempered from lack of sleep and the stress of preparing for another child. But they also laughed more, found small moments of joy in Thomas's antics and each other's company. They were learning that a good marriage wasn't one without conflict, but one where you fought fair and made up honestly. Winter came again, and with it the close quarters and cabin fever that made everyone irritable. Thomas was into everything, Clara was huge and uncomfortable, and Ethan was worried about things he couldn't control, whether they'd have enough food, whether Clara would be all right during the birth, whether he'd be a good father to 2 children instead of 1. One particularly hard day in January, when Thomas had been crying for hours and Clara was too tired to do anything but cry along with him, Ethan took the boy outside despite the cold and walked him around the yard until he finally settled. When he came back in, Clara was lying on the floor near the fireplace, staring at the ceiling. "I can't do this," she said flatly. "I can't be pregnant and raise Thomas and keep this house running and pretend I'm not falling apart." Ethan set Thomas in his basket and lay down beside Clara on the floor. "So don't pretend." "What?" "Don't pretend you're not falling apart. Just fall apart. I'll catch you." Clara turned her head to look at him. "It's not that simple." "Why not? You're exhausted and pregnant and trying to do everything yourself even though you don't have to. I'm here. Let me help." "You are helping? Then let me help more." Ethan rolled onto his side. "Tell me what you need." Clara closed her eyes. "I need to know this is going to be okay. That we're going to be okay. That I'm not going to lose myself trying to be everything for everyone." "You're not going to lose yourself," Ethan said. "And even if you do, I'll help you find your way back. That's what we do." Clara opened her eyes, and they were full of tears. "I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared of the birth, of something going wrong, of not being a good enough mother to 2 children. You're already a good mother. Thomas adores you, and you're not doing the birth alone this time. I'll be there. And if something goes wrong—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "If something goes wrong, we'll face it together. Promise me you won't let me die alone." The words hit Ethan like a punch. "Clara, promise me. If something happens during the birth, if I'm dying, promise me you'll be there. That you won't leave me alone in some room while someone else deals with it." Ethan pulled her close, holding her as tightly as he dared given her condition. "I promise. I'll be right there, holding your hand, until the very end if it comes to that. But it won't. You're going to be fine." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I believe it. I have to believe it because the alternative is unthinkable." They lay there on the floor, holding each other, and Clara cried until she had nothing left. Then Ethan helped her up, got her into bed, took care of Thomas, and made dinner. And the next day they got up and did it all again. Because that's what life on the frontier required. Getting up, even when you didn't want to, and doing the work that needed doing. The baby came in early March, a week before Clara's expected date. It was a hard labor, longer than Thomas's had been, and there were moments when Ethan was terrified he was going to lose her. But Clara was tougher than she looked, and when their daughter finally arrived, small and perfect and screaming with outrage, Clara laughed through her tears of relief. "A girl," she said, cradling the baby. "We have a daughter." Ethan stared at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers grasping at nothing. He'd thought he understood love when Thomas came into his life, but this was different. This was his daughter, his blood, a child he'd made with the woman he loved. "What should we name her?" Clara asked. They'd discussed names but never settled on anything. Now, looking at his daughter, Ethan knew. "Margaret, after your mother." Clara's face crumpled. "Really? Really? She gave us a gift when we needed it most. Seems right to return the favor." So Margaret Ryder entered the world, and with her came a shift in their family. Thomas was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her constantly, bringing her toys she was too young to appreciate. Clara juggled 2 children with a grace that surprised even her, and Ethan learned that his capacity for love was larger than he'd ever imagined. Spring brought new growth in the garden, in their family, in the small community that was forming in the valley. The Harpers had a baby that summer, and Joe Miller finally worked up the courage to court the widow Thompson from the next settlement over. They had gatherings now, potlucks where everyone brought what they could spare, evenings where they'd trade stories and jokes and the kind of companionship that made the isolation bearable. Clara thrived in a way Ethan had never seen. She organized the gatherings, helped Mrs. Harper with her baby, taught the younger women how to preserve food and manage a household. She became someone people turned to for advice and support, and she gave it freely, drawing on the hard lessons she'd learned. One evening, after a particularly successful gathering where everyone had eaten too much and stayed too late, Ethan found Clara on the porch, watching the stars. "You all right?" he asked, settling beside her. "More than all right." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "I was just thinking about that day you found me on the roof, about how sure I was that my life was over. And now?" "Now I think that was the day it actually started." She looked up at him. "I spent so much time waiting for life to happen to me. Waiting for James to come back. Waiting for someone to save me. Waiting for permission to be happy. But happiness isn't something you wait for. It's something you build." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "Wish I could take credit for that wisdom. You can. You showed me what it looked like to choose your life instead of letting it choose you. You stayed when everyone else left. You built this." She gestured to the cabin, the valley, the life they'd created. "Not for me, but with me. That's the difference. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to figure it out alone." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night, crickets and distant coyotes, the soft breathing of their children inside the cabin. After a while, Clara spoke again. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd ridden past that day? If you'd seen the smoke and decided it wasn't your problem?" Ethan considered this. "Sometimes. But then I think about Thomas learning to walk, or Margaret's first smile, or the way you look when you're working in the garden, and I realize wondering about alternative paths is pointless. This is the path we're on, and it's a good one. Even with all the hard parts? Especially with the hard parts. The hard parts are what make the good parts mean something." Clara turned to face him, her expression serious. "I want you to know something. When I married you, it was practical, self-preservation, a way to survive. I know. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about survival and started being about living. You became my best friend, my partner, the person I trust most in the world. And I need you to know that if I had to do it all over again, all the pain, all the loss, all the mistakes, I would. Because they led me here. To you." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Clara, let me finish." She cupped his face in her hands. "I love you, not because you saved me. You didn't. I saved myself. But because you gave me the space to do it. Because you saw me at my worst and didn't try to fix me or change me. You just stood beside me and helped me become who I was supposed to be all along." Ethan kissed her, slow and deep, trying to communicate everything he felt that words couldn't capture. When they pulled apart, He rested his forehead against hers. "You know what I've learned?" he said quietly. "That there's courage in staying. Everyone talks about the courage it takes to leave, to start over, to run towards something new. But nobody talks about the courage it takes to stay when things get hard. To wake up every day and choose the same person, the same life, the same struggles. That's real courage. And you have it in spades." Clara smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We both do. We stayed, Ethan. When everything in us said to run, we stayed. And we'll keep staying," he promised, "through whatever comes next." The years rolled on, bringing joy and hardship in equal measure. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved animals and spent hours in the barn with the horses. Margaret was her mother's daughter, fierce, stubborn, quick to laugh, and quick to anger. They had another child, a boy they named Ethan Jr., called EJ to avoid confusion. Clara's mother visited twice more before she died, and each time she left, she did so with the certainty that her daughter was exactly where she needed to be. The valley filled in with more families, enough to warrant a one-room schoolhouse and a proper trading post. Ethan served on the school board, Clara organized the women's auxiliary that raised money for supplies and helped families in need. They became pillars of the small community, the kind of people others looked to for stability and wisdom. But they never forgot where they'd come from, never forgot the burned homestead, the roof where Clara had been waiting to die, the desperate choice to try when everything said to give up. They told their children the truth, not a sanitized version, but the real story with all its mess and complication. They wanted Thomas and Margaret and EJ to understand that life wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about making choices, learning from mistakes, and having the courage to keep trying even when you failed. One evening, when Clara was in her 50s and their children were grown with families of their own, she and Ethan sat on the porch of the cabin they'd expanded 3 times over the years. The valley was dotted with houses now, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the sound of children playing, carrying on the wind. "You think we did all right?" Clara asked. "With the kids? With the life we built?" Ethan looked at the woman beside him. Gray-haired now, her face lined with years of hard work and laughter, her hands worn but still capable. He thought about the scared woman on the roof, the way she'd looked at him with empty eyes and no hope. Then he thought about everything that had come after, the arguments and reconciliations, the births, and the one heartbreaking miscarriage between EJ and their youngest, Sarah, the days of backbreaking work and the nights of quiet contentment. "Yeah," he said, "I think we did all right." Clara reached over, taking his hand, their fingers laced together with the ease of 30 years of practice. "You know what I'm most proud of?" "What?" "That we chose each other. Every day, through everything, we kept choosing each other. That's not luck or fate or anything outside our control. That's us, making the decision to stay." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Best decision I ever made." "Even when I'm impossible?" "Especially then." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the valley they'd claimed as their own. And sitting there in the fading light, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, Ethan understood something fundamental about happiness. It wasn't something you found or stumbled into or received as a gift. It was something you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. It was showing up for the people you loved even when it was hard. It was forgiving yourself for the mistakes and celebrating the victories. It was recognizing that the journey mattered more than the destination, and that sometimes the most extraordinary lives were built from the most ordinary moments. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Clara leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. They sat like that until the stars came out, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the ruins. 2 people who'd learned that you don't wait for your life to begin. You choose it, you fight for it, you build it with your own hands. And in the end, that choice, that fight, that building, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Because life isn't about the perfect beginning or the fairy tale ending. It's about the middle, the messy, complicated, beautiful middle where you figure out who you are and who you want to be. Where you learn that strength comes not from never falling, but from getting back up. Where you discover that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about choosing someone real and building something lasting together. Claire had stopped waiting that day she came down from the roof, and Ethan had stopped running. Together, they'd learned to stay, to build, to choose each other over and over again. They transformed a valley of ash and abandonment into a place of belonging. They turned survival into life and loneliness into love. And in doing so, they'd proven something essential about the human spirit, that we're not defined by the things that break us, but by what we build after. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That home isn't where you're born or where you run to, but where you choose to stay, where you put down roots and grow something worth keeping. Their story wasn't remarkable because it was easy or perfect. It was remarkable because it was real, full of struggle and setback, but also resilience and hope. It was the story of two broken people who refused to stay broken, who looked at the ruins of their lives and decided to build something better, who understood that the greatest act of rebellion against a world that tries to break you is to survive it, to thrive in it, to create beauty and meaning from the ashes. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the valley settled into sleep, Clara and Ethan stayed on their porch, hands linked, hearts steady, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because they'd learned the most important lesson of all, that life is short and hard and often unfair, but it's also worth fighting for, worth building for, worth staying for, together.